host right now. Just
Yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to give you the I'm going to make you the host and see whether or not you can record it as well at the same time.
okay.
Again, I'm pretty sure that you can, but I just want to make sure.
Right.
So, all of a sudden I can't figure out how to make you the host. Oh, I recall now. I recall. Okay, so you're the host now, and so you can see whether or not you can record.
I don't see a record button.
Have you tried it?
It says it's being recorded. I don't see a record button on my side.
Well, in order for you to record, you
Oh yeah, the record button.
okay.
Okay, I'm going to say record on this computer. Okay, so I mean, I said I'm recording it. So what it's doing in reality, I have no idea.
I think it's probably recorded. It's probably
Okay.
recorded. Um, let's hope so. Anyway, otherwise I'll have to mail you the the file. Hi,
Or
Harriet. How you doing? Um, so we'll see how many people are going to arrive tonight.
yeah.
Um, so Patrick's not here either for this meeting or the next.
Okay.
And but he'll be looking at this recording. I suppose when I'll probably have an opportunity to exchange an email with Patrick before the meeting that he returns, before that meeting on which he returns, and I'll decide with him whether or not he wants to lead that meeting. And in the meantime, I'll assume that I'm going to lead the next meeting, unless one of the members that are here showing up regularly decides they want to take on some of the text, which would be great if they did, you know. Um, so we'll just have plenty of opportunity to figure that out before the end of this meeting.
Perfect.
And what else? Do we have any other business to attend to?
No. So where are you located?
Toronto.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there was another interesting meetup in Toronto today that was not a Zoom meeting, it was in place. So, but it looked
What
really
was what was
it was on,
that?
it was on determinism.
Oh,
Yeah. So it
isn't it
looked really
interesting? Determinism keeps coming up all over the place. I wonder what it's all about. You know, everyone's talking determinism all the time.
yeah,
It's a pretty common philosophical
yeah,
principle, you know.
yeah. I think the problem is that the facts that we discover in physics are at odds with what we think is true, you
Yeah,
know. So
yeah,
there's this constant conflict because everything seems to be very deterministic and very predictable and stuff, but all of a sudden we think we have free choice. So we're thinking, how do I reconcile those two? You know,
yeah,
they're at odds, you know.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. And it's so. I mean, really, ever since the Enlightenment, people have recognized that the laws of physics are necessary laws that prevail through all of nature. And I mean, it's not really a very big leap for Spinoza to say, hey, we're part of nature, so therefore we're determined in exactly the same way. I mean, you know, but it was
yeah,
still nevertheless very startling for people to acknowledge, you know, to recognize that and to accept it. It was like, wait a minute, you know, because I mean, even in Immanuel Kant, you know, when he's talking about you know the distinction between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world, and he has to resort to this really, it seems to me, most far-fetched notion that God would ensure that the laws of physics, so in other words, the necessary conditions of existence would be consistent with some sort of notion of religious values, or the principle, virtue in general. It's
Yeah.
just really one of those crazy notions that but it's never gone away. It's never gone away.
As
I'm,
I
I'm
am,
reading Schelling's essay on the inquiry into the nature of human freedom, and it's a constant. Well, just as the title can tell you, that is really the fundamental concern: is that how can we talk about morality if everything is unfolds of a necessity?
yeah. What did you read Hume?
I have read Hume, but I can't remember. I remember I read his lectures or his dialogue on natural religion, and I can't remember the details now, unfortunately.
Yeah. Because
Um,
I wrote that paper on determinism some years ago, and a professor of philosophy at one of the local universities read that, and he said, "Well, yeah, you just basically repeated Hume."
right.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's kind of interesting. You come to the same conclusions if you think hard enough about it. I guess
Right.
this, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting problem. As I think I mentioned before, because I mentioned to a lot of people, but one of the topics that's interested me for many years is artificial intelligence. And the way you approach artificial intelligence, the way I've approached it, is you try to introspect and think about what's going on in your head, and then you try to duplicate it in software, right? And people have been trying to do that for about 20 years, or no, about 60, 70 years, with no luck at all. No one's been able to do it, right? Then all of a sudden, recently, they've created artificial intelligence. It's just, it happened 3 years ago, I think. And I use it almost every day. It's phenomenal. It's unbelievable. And but the thing is, the way that works is not the way you think it works. What they did was when you type in a word in a text, like in your phone, you type in a word and it tries to guess the next word. That's what this AI thing is doing. So when you type a question, it's trying to guess what the other next words would be. So it has no logic or reason. It's just repeating strings that it found because they stuffed it and taught it with everything that was in there. So what that makes me think is that when we try something weird like this, just text manipulation, we have artificial intelligence all of a sudden. So it makes me think, what are we really doing? Maybe we're not doing the reasoning we think.
Yeah.
And, and then to prove it is all the people that have different religious and political views.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what you say, they believe it. That's it. They were fed those strings when they were small, and now they're just regurgitating it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
And they're incapable, really incapable of, or nearly incapable of jumping, making another way of thinking.
Yeah.
So it makes me think that rather than us mimicking ourselves to create artificial intelligence, now we've stumbled on artificial intelligence indirectly. They weren't even trying to build something intelligent. They were trying to build something that guessed words, and all of a sudden they have AI. And so now I go back the other way and think, well, maybe we're more like that. And it's more consistent with other things I see.
Yeah. 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 I know,
Yeah.
even the notion that our minds are constituted by our social and political environment. I mean,
Yeah.
even to place limits like that. So when someone comes along and says to me, well, you're speaking, you know, in a way that reflects, or your thought is determined by the values and assumptions that hold for your social environment in general. So you're not really thinking freely, you're just basically expressing what is conventionally understood to be true and
Yeah.
mistaking it for a recognition of your truth. I have to tell you that I am very dubious about that. I think to myself, No, I don't believe that my mind is strictly constituted by my social environment. I just and it's not because I really feel like it that it would compromise my sense of integrity or something like that. Or that
Unless,
I would rather feel that I was more of an original or spontaneous thinker. It's not for that reason. It's because I think that often when you're pursuing an idea and it's a very detailed, like you're trying to pursue an essential point, it's hard for me to imagine that my social environment could provide me with that answer, like in other words, that sounds very vague, but if I say, for example, if somebody's talking to me about there's kind of social values that obtain in the world today, for example, let's just take racism. Racism is such a hot topic, right?
yeah, yeah,
Everyone is paranoid about using the wrong language or expressing the wrong kind of sentiment or whatever. I feel like I am absolutely free in my point of view of racism. And I also believe that it's actually perfectly correct. Like, in other words, I am not somebody who is prejudiced in the ordinary sense of the word as having assumptions that are not justified in any way. I feel
right,
like
right,
I can justify my point of view completely, and it's also quite correct. And if I look at the way the social environment determines the way that some people think about it, I think I can draw a distinction between myself and those people. Like there are some people who say, well, there are certain kind of language that you simply cannot use because that is racist. And I look at it and say, no, I'm sorry, I disagree with you entirely. I can use that language, and that does not mean that there is no strict implication between me using that language and being a racist. You know what I
right,
mean? Like that's just a false premise to begin with.
yeah,
And as a matter of fact, it's a very simplistic, sort of crude way of thinking about the whole problem. But
yeah.
um, so for reasons like that, I often think to myself, I don't believe that my mind is not free. In other words, creative,
Yeah.
spontaneously creative. And so that's why I resist the idea. But somebody would have to provide me with some really very compelling evidence before I would start to accept that idea.
Yeah, I intellectually believe that we are automatons in that sense,
Oh,
for
you
sure.
do?
Yeah. I don't act that way, and I don't feel that way, but intellectually when I think about it, because a lot of things intellectually, like about atoms and stuff like that, but you don't think about things as collections of atoms. You think about a person in a book and all those things. Well, it's the same thing. So I intellectually believe about hard determinism and the fact that we're just more
Right.
complex stuff like that. But
Yeah.
feel that
Yeah.
way? Do I act that way? No, but I know ultimately, I know intellectually that ultimately that's what's going on. And I
Well, that's
think
very
that,
interesting. That's very
yeah, I think
interesting.
my wife has commented a number of times that she thinks I'm more stoic than most people. And um, I feel like I'm just me, so I don't think I'm being too much this or too much that. I'm just me, right? But
Right.
uh, but if I was to try to think of why that would be the case, is because my answer is, well, I know that these things are just what they are, and there's nothing I can do about it. You try your
Yeah.
best, whatever, and whatever happens, happens.
Yeah. Well, I actually, when I was about 20, I started doing really intense psychoanalysis, and and I did that for about 10 years, and it was really very intense. And then I stopped for 10 years, and then I took it up again, and I did it with even more intensity. I was going to see a doctor sometimes 4 times a week, and what I think in retrospect, when I look back at it now, what I find remarkable is that I feel like, insofar as in analysis, you're talking about how a person's mind and personality and sort of mode of life is constituted through their environment, right? To a certain extent, that's true, but then there's also other complications. And I would say that what I really marvel at in retrospect is how little change was actually ever affected in my personality. You know what I mean? Like I realize now that despite the intensity of the effort, I did not actually free myself from the kind of compulsive behavior that I was subject to prior to being an analysis, you know? Like it's just simply, in a way, you would say it didn't work. Like in other words, I did not change, you know? So it almost
Right.
seems like what I'm saying is basically a confirmation of what you're saying, is that in a way there is a kind of a determinism that is established in the mind of a person, and once it's been established, it's absolutely established. You know what I mean? It's almost like it's impossible to free yourself and try to create your own personality, you know, create your own way of being, right?
Right. Now, this relates to Spinoza's three types of knowledge, because at the first kind of knowledge, you're aware of different personalities and stuff, but you don't know much about it. And at the second level, you go through all this evaluation, analysis, and stuff like that, and learn a lot of technical things and stuff like that. But it's not until you get to the third kind of knowledge, intuitive knowledge, where it actually becomes part of you. Where you've actually changed something. You say, I liken it to riding a bicycle. The first level of knowledge is where you see someone ride a bicycle. The second, so it's possible. The second level is where you go through a class and they teach you about balance and steering and all that stuff. And so you understand how to ride a bicycle. But the third level is when you get on the bicycle and you all of a sudden you intuit the whole thing, and it's all, straightforward. You don't think about it anymore. Well,
Yeah.
likewise, go through this analysis. That's kind of like the second level, where they're making you aware of a lot of things and you're learning a lot and all this stuff. And but until you get to that third level, if that's however you do that, then the change never occurs. It's just a theoretical thing.
Well, I'm certain that I reached the third level in analysis. I'm certain there's no question about that. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that there were times when I really just felt like I had lost my sense of identity completely. But then what happens in analysis is that when you stop treatment, instead of things being up in the air, everything falls back into a kind of pre-established order, right? In order for you to maintain your, just your sort of sense of autonomy in general, you have to allow things just to happen naturally, so to speak. And I've actually found myself living just the way that I had before. You know what I mean? Like nothing really had changed at all. I don't think I think if I had not been through this really intense analysis for a long time, I would have just been exactly the same, or maybe I don't know. It's impossible. Subjectivity is impossible to evaluate. For a person to evaluate their own subjectivity, it's virtually impossible in my view. So
Well, what I've found is that changing other people is not possible, and changing yourself is very difficult.
yeah.
Okay, so I guess we should get started. Is everybody here that's going to be here, I guess?
I think we could get started now. You're still the host, so you can share your screen or do whatever you want, Blake.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to share, so I'll just share my face, I guess.
Oh, I thought you wanted to share the screen. Okay, so just excuse me for just one moment. I just want to get a beverage of some kind.
Okay. So, Dick, why that picture in the background?
Yes. Am I audible? Let me see here.
Yes. Linda Blair.
Testing. Let's see here. setting my mic up. Now I'm gonna do this here. Scarlet. There we go. Why do I have this photo?
Yeah.
Oh, this is a picture of me many years ago when I was younger and more attractive. And
Okay.
I decided that it'd be better to. Just kidding. No, this is Dick Smith. He is my role model. And now that I'm aging and pain is accumulating over time in my life, I'm retreating further and further back into my past. And so this is what Terrence McKenna says. He says when things fall apart, societies and individuals go back to the past, to the last time their lives really made sense. So the last time my life really made sense is when I had the Dick Smith makeup kit. It was the best Christmas gift I ever got. He's the special effects art. He invented special effects makeup. He did Godfather, Little Big Man, Exorcist, Ghost Story, The Hunger with David Bowie.
Yeah. Yeah, I tried to get my son to watch that movie with me, The Exorcist. I gave up.
It's too boring these days for kids, isn't it?
I guess. Well, he doesn't like anything old, you know. He doesn't like any kind of old movies. He just thinks they're, I guess, out of date or something. I don't know. But I saw that movie when I was, you know, younger, and it was a pretty significant movie at the time.
Yeah.
I think it's the greatest horror movie ever made. My
Yeah.
favorite horror movie by far. I can't think of anything that comes close to it.
Right. It probably was more scary than other movies that I've seen, or almost every other movie. Yeah. That was
And more
so-
disturbing, you know, because the idea that you have this vulnerable little child who they have to save the life of this child, and yet she's actually the devil simultaneously. You know, I think that's just a really extraordinary idea. And it made for great drama.
Okay, so Spinoza. If we start at, I'm kind of going to start off where I left off last time, and assume that it made some sense. But so now I'm going to go into starting with E1 P11 and go into, you know, explaining his definitions and his propositions on that and what they mean, and we can discuss it. Feel free, anyone, to interrupt, and you know, we could talk about it. So E1 P11 says God or substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which express eternal and infinite essence, necessarily exists. So he defines God or substance before this, and as I mentioned last meeting, it really boils down to what we call the word universe or everything or something like that. So he's just basically saying that the universe exists, and it seems like a little bit of a common sense notion, but he's going through a lot of detail to prove everything to the nth degree. You know, try to make it this very clear. So what is he proving? He's really proving the universe exists. So God necessarily exists because we would all agree that the universe exists. We might argue about what the universe is and whether we're just imagining it or whatever, but whatever that is, it exists.
Oh, you know what? I would already interrupt you. I would interrupt you immediately, like,
Okay.
because I mean, you're saying that Spinoza is trying to prove that the universe exists and that we could just take that for granted, right? But I don't think he's actually doing that. I think what he's doing is he is explaining the necessary essential attributes that substance has, like what the nature of substance is of necessity, right? And now, again, when he's talking about substance, I think that you can say that, well, I believe that Spinoza is simply assuming that there's an identity between the world, or reality, if you like, and substance. Maybe you can make that case. But in the case of substance, he's not simply saying that substance exists or the world exists. He's saying of necessity, according to a rational demonstration, it exists of necessity. We cannot pretend for a moment that the world does not exist. The idea cannot be entertained. We cannot imagine a world where it were possible that the world would not exist.
Right. And a simple way of looking at that is that if you define God or substance or nature as being basically everything, the universe, and if I have a thought and say, God doesn't exist, well, if I'm part of that, which he proves in the prior propositions, if I'm part of this big whole and I have that thought, then obviously something exists, because I don't know for sure that I have a physical body or whatever, but something had that thought. And whatever
that's one of the proofs. That's one of the proofs. That's one of the proofs.
It proves that the whole exists because something had that thought. So something exists. And if I've proved to the nth degree that everything is part of God, then if anything exists, God must exist. So it's just pretty much that simple. And I think that's,
yeah, he's saying that, if something like ourselves, any given individual is obviously finite, and he's already demonstrated that substance is infinite. And he's saying, given insofar as the essence of something is equivalent to the power it has to exist, it would be absurd to say that something finite necessarily exists, and to say that something infinite, in other words, something with infinite power to exist, does not exist. It's just irrational to make that claim, right? So, okay, I just wanted to make the point that for Spinoza, he's not simply saying, look, we all know the world exists. That's not what he's doing. In my view, what he's doing is saying, I think I just proved to you that the world exists of necessity. It cannot fail to be. It's not possible that the world should exist. Should not exist, right?
Right.
Okay.
So let's see. In his first proof, he says by E1A7, which is if a thing can be conceived as not existing, its essence does not involve existence. So if I can conceive of some kind of dog in my house, but it doesn't exist, then I can conceive of it not existing. So then it doesn't have that existence isn't part of what makes it up. But with God, it has to exist because that's one of the essential attributes of it. And so therefore it must exist. Let me see here. And E1P7, it pertains to the nature of substance to exist. So it's kind of like the first axiom, or the first definition rather, which is really heavier weight than I think most people give it. The first definition, which yes is just a definition, but if you understand what it's defining, it explains a lot. By cause of itself, I understand whose essence involves existence, or that whose nature can be conceived except cannot be conceived except as existing. So if something is cause of itself, it had to always exist. It's really logical there, because if nothing created it and it exists, it must have always existed. You see, so that's kind of the notion there. And he shows that the only thing that has that definition is substance, God, or nature, all those things. So they necessarily exist. Let me see. The second proof, he says, thinking of a line number. So if you have a line number, which has, like all the positive numbers this way and all the negative numbers that way, you say that all of the numbers are on that list. So it has every single number. So if you could conceive of something that doesn't exist, if you can think of something that doesn't exist, then it must contradict something in itself. Otherwise, it must exist. So let me give you an example with the line number. If I said all negative numbers that are greater than 7, obviously that doesn't exist. There are none. because it has a fundamental contradiction, being more than 3 or 7 or whatever, and being a negative number. So you can see that so if there's not a contradiction in the number, then all numbers would exist on that line number scale. 27, 36, 52.8, -7, they all exist. No matter what number you think of, they're on that line number, unless there's a contradiction about it. So if there's a contradiction, then it does not exist. So that's his second proof. So if you could think of a contradiction in the idea of God, then that would negate its existence. But he shows with all the prior propositions that it's consistent and it's beyond a doubt. And his third proof, which is actually sort of a restatement of the first proof, an entity that exists is clearly more powerful than an entity that does not exist, right? Because a bear that's chasing you in the woods is a lot more powerful than an imagined bear that's in the woods. You could still die from it, but it's a lot more dangerous, a real bear. So obviously, the real bear is more powerful than something that's imagined. So he said, if God doesn't exist, then the real thing would be more powerful than God. So in other words, if God didn't exist, then this container of water would be more powerful than God, because it has existence as one of its attributes or one of its qualities. You see, so that's his proof there. Then in his scholium, he has a proof based on experience. An infinite entity must have infinite ability to exist, because the definition of God is something with infinite extent, infinite thought. So if there's nothing more powerful than it, then it obviously must, if anything exists, it must exist. That's another way of saying that. So does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, now one part I have here is that, in a sense, E1P11, which is what we just discussed, is essentially, it's kind of old news. And the reason I say old news is because if you had been following the previous propositions and stuff, it would be obvious that God exists. It's pretty straightforward. In E1P11, he makes it more explicit, but you've already got the idea by the time you get there, supposedly. Let me look at some of the propositions that kind of bring that out. So I have E1 definition 1. Let me read that real quick. By cause of itself, I understand. Yeah, that's the one I just covered. Then E1D3. By substance, I understand that which is in itself and conceived through itself, that whose concept does not require the concept of another thing from which it must be formed. So he's really saying that substance is this self-caused thing, if you look at D1 and D3. You see?
Yeah, but I think we have to make it clear that substance doesn't require a conception of another thing. But
Right.
then what is implied here is there's an equivalence between understanding substance independently of another thing, and also the being of substance being independent of another thing, right? And also the notion of cause. Like, if we can understand substance without depending on another thing in order to form the conception of substance, that shows in and of itself that substance is not caused by another thing. Our understanding and causation are equivalent here.
Right. So that's one of the forms of causes by one of Aristotle's cause types.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it's really important to recognize too that for Descartes, he had to make a special category of efficient causation. For Descartes, he said, look, everything in the world needs an efficient cause in order to come into being, right? That's not true of God.
Right.
The claim he made is God's an exception. God can be the efficient cause of himself. So in other words, I have to violate the principle of identity, right? And in the case of God, I have to violate the principle of identity and say that very thing which causes God is God himself. So I'm making the cause and the effect identical. But that's not exactly what Spinoza is doing, because Spinoza, when he's talking about cause, he's talking about, I believe, formal cause.
Mhm.
He's saying that God is not the efficient cause of himself, but instead that God has an essence. And one of the essential attributes of God, one of the essences of God, so to speak, is the existence itself. So the essence itself, essence is a formal cause. When you talk about a formal cause, you say, what is the thing? You know, and you say the thing is like it's a acorn. And you know that the efficient cause that will bring the oak tree into existence involves a lot of different things. But the essence of the oak tree is in the acorn. And that's what is an explanation for the oak tree. In the same way, existence as part of the essence of God is the complete explanation for the existence of God, right? So it's not efficient causation, it's formal causation. So that's one big difference between Descartes and Spinoza. And I think that in this example that you look at here, when you say, by cause of itself, I understand that whose essence involves existence, or that whose nature cannot be conceived except as existing, you don't need efficient causation at all. Efficient causation doesn't play a part here, right? And then when you get to proposition 11, he doesn't use that definition in any of the proofs. He uses a wide variety of different proofs that pertain more to the nature of substance than anything like what we conceive of as God, right? So for Spinoza, he doesn't have to make a special exception with respect to God, and he also doesn't rely on efficient causation, at least not when we're talking about principal, essential attributes of substance. When you talk about modifications, modes, you know, limited modes of existence, then efficient causation obviously plays a big role. But anyway, I've gone on long enough.
Okay, so do we have anything else with that, or should we get on to E1, P12? Okay.
Well, I do think that what we should do is recognize that whereas in the definition, the first definition, essence involving existence, that's a definition. It's not applied to God. It's just a definition. This is what Spinoza says. This is what I understand when I say that that thing that has essence as existence as part of its essence, that necessarily exists, just as you said. That's a definition, not for God in particular, but for any given thing that has existence as part of its essence, right? And when we get into proposition 11, what is interesting, what should be recognized, is that he offers demonstrations for the necessary existence of substance, not necessarily God, but then makes the fundamental assumption that God is a substance, which of course just follows of necessity as well. So it's not a problem, right? But I think it's worth recognizing that unlike Descartes, Spinoza doesn't just come along and say, look we all know the world exists. On the contrary, he demonstrates it, right? And if you can find a flaw in his demonstration, then that's an entirely different matter, right?
Right. Okay.
Sorry, I'm talking so much, by the way.
Oh, cool. Okay, so E1, P12. No attribute of a substance can be truly conceived from which it follows that substance can be divided. So the point is that as we learn later, the attributes are all just the same thing looked at in different ways. So you really can't have a separate attribute that's not another way of looking at the single substance. So let me see what I wrote here. Descartes considered the attributes of thought and extension to be two separate substances. However, Spinoza is arguing that there is nothing in the attributes that could lead you to that conclusion. And as we all know, the problem that Descartes ran into is for Descartes, thought and extension were two different substances. And he ran into the problem of how they communicate. And they had to communicate because when I have an idea to move my arm, somehow my physical arm moves. So obviously there must be a relationship between thought and extension like that. So so that's when he ran into a problem. And of course he introduced, Descartes introduced really an anthropomorphic God, in the end to explain everything. A separate God that had created everything and mediates everything and all that kind of stuff. So, but Spinoza didn't go that way. He was kind of like a response to Descartes. So Spinoza unified the concept of thought and extension as two attributes of a single substance. So now he didn't have a communication problem anymore because they were all part of the same substance. In here I wrote, if thought and extension were two separate substances by E1P2, two substances having different attributes have nothing in common with one another, they would have nothing in common. But since they do, we know that they're the same substance. So the point is that we know that thought and physical things relate to each other. And so therefore that proves that they're just of one substance, because otherwise they'd be outside if they didn't have a relation to it. So that's all I have on E1P12. Any questions on that? Okay, let's see. E1P13. He says a substance which is absolutely infinite is indivisible. So what that means is it's the same idea as before. In Proposition 5, he says you can't have two substances, there's only one substance. And then in Proposition 11, he said God or substance necessarily exists. So what you have is the whole idea that there's only one substance and you can't have more than one. You can have a multiple of them. And if attributes are just way of looking at that one substance, that doesn't give any reason to have more than one substance. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Kind of zipping through these things here. Then E1P14 is except God, no substance can be or be conceived. So he's basically describing God as being everything. The substance, God, it's everything. So if you find something new, like let's say you discover a new planet somewhere or something like that, well, that doesn't make a new substance. What that does is it just enlarges your understanding of the existing substance, because it's all related, it's all interrelated, it all has the potential of changing each other and interacting and stuff like that. So it's more like the ocean that I described before. So it's all the particles of the ocean are moving around and interacting with each other. Some may be very far, but they could still, they're ultimately connected in a remote way.
Can I ask a question? It's not really directly relevant, but I think it's worth taking the opportunity here. And that is, this originated with Leibniz. He was the first one to ask, well, what about having a substance, and you can have an infinity of attributes in that substance that God has, right? Why not another substance that has only one of the attributes of God? Why would that not be possible? In other words, why would you not have two substances that share one attribute but have other attributes to distinguish them from one another?
Right. Well, for one thing, an attribute is not a real thing in the sense that you can't disconnect an attribute from substance. It's kind of like you can't have something that's blue without a physical object, Right. So it's the same kind of idea. So, and the reason you can't have more than one substance is a lot of reasons. I mean, he goes through ad nauseum about, why there can't be more than more than one substance. But another way of looking at it is if you had one substance, like let's say there's a parallel universe somewhere, right? And you say, oh, that's a different substance. and you discover a door that leads between the two so that you can, well, now one thing is interacting with the other. So really what you have is, again, just something, a larger concept, a larger understanding. For example, our understanding of the world, you know, a long time ago was that this was everything. Everything was just this flat earth thing, that kind of thing. And then our understanding about the, you know, and the stars were just little pinpoints in something that encircled the earth or whatever. And then as we learned more about stars and solar systems and the sun and all these things, it didn't change the universe. It only changed our understanding of the universe. You see what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
for example, we found a separate substance, what we thought was a separate substance. As soon as we perceived it, that would prove that it's just a larger understanding of the one existing substance. So if, like I say, if a good example is like a parallel universe, if you think, oh, well, there's this whole other universe here. Well, if and when that ever interacts with us, the second it interacts with us, it's just part of the whole. Because now we're interacting with it, just like me and eating the banana. You know, you can't tell where one leaves off and one picks up, you know. So it just becomes, so all the things that they discover that, oh, well, there's this and there's that, and there's theoretical this and theoretical that. None of those negate what Spinoza said. All they do is enlarge your understanding of what he of the whole. That's all. Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, I think it also has to have something to do with the fact that, you know, God has an infinity of attributes. So there's no way that you can have a substance that has an attribute. I understand attribute as being the essence of the substance, by the way. You could not have a substance that had an attribute that God didn't have. You know what I mean? He's got an infinity of attributes. So therefore, he of necessity would share in that attribute. So you couldn't distinguish it absolutely in those terms. But the other thing is that you know, if the substance has a single attribute, and it of necessity is an attribute that God has as well, but it lacks all the other attributes, it's still kind of difficult for me to get my head around the
Well,
why that should be impossible. Why that should be impossible. I mean,
Spinoza, his idea of infinite is a little interesting because who was it? The commentator Jonathan Bennett wrote some stuff against Spinoza, but every place where he disagreed with Spinoza, it was my opinion that he didn't understand. For example, Spinoza talks about infinite, and Jonathan Bennett talks about, well, there's infinite positive numbers, but all the numbers are not there because it doesn't contain any negative numbers. You know what I'm saying? So you could have infinite and not have all. But what I would argue is when you read Spinoza's text, you understand that when he uses the word infinite, he's not really talking about something that doesn't end, because something positive numbers don't end, right? But they still don't have all of them. When he uses the word infinite, he means all of them. He doesn't mean something that just goes on in one direction forever. He's talking about whatever is a number is in this set of numbers. You see what I'm saying? He's talking about all. So when he says that substance is infinite, which he does in the other propositions, he's not talking about that it goes off in one direction forever. You know, he's talking about all of it. So you see what I'm saying? So that's a pretty big distinction, and one that's not always caught.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I read some of Jonathan Bennett's commentary as well, and he also said that, speaking of the infinity of attributes that we do not know, he suggested that what Spinoza meant by that was all of the attributes, and that ultimately there are only two: extension and thought. You know,
Right.
so
In one of his letters that comes up, and he says, no, there's an infinite number. It's not just two. And the reason he says is that the human brain is only capable of understanding certain things. For example, I can't pick up radio waves. You know, they exist, but I can't pick them up. Now, but I can pick up the idea of thought, and I can pick up the idea of an extension, because those are things my brain is capable of absorbing. The reason that you have to have more than two attributes is because he discusses in the ethics in the beginning, in the parts we've already just covered, is that you can't have something, if something comes to an end, it must be limited by something else of a similar kind, right? So if you had only two attributes, they'd have to be cut off by some third attribute. You say there'd have to be another attribute that would limit those other two. And since Spinoza shows that substance has no limits, there'd have to be an infinite number of these attributes. You see, so that's kind of the conceptual proof that there's more than the two attributes. It's just
That's a
that
very good proof. That's a very good proof. I had not thought of that before. There have to be something to limit the number of attributes, but that attribute that posed a limit to the number of attributes would have to be limited as well. Like, in other words, you would need a sufficient reason to explain this third attribute and the fourth attribute, and it would go on for infinity.
Yeah.
So that's also a good way of looking at it. I don't think that Spinoza ever used that, because he always thought of substance and essential attributes as being infinite in the positive sense. You know what I mean? Like, not delimiting in any way in nature an essential attribute. That was part of his understanding of the word infinity. When he said infinity, he meant impossible to limit, to impose a limit on. No, it's actually impossible to qualify in any way. And yeah, so that's a pretty good explanation. But I remember somewhere along the line, I read an article or something like that, which made it crystal clear for me how one substance could not be distinguished from substance in general according to attributes. One, I think it had something to do with, you know, even though we're talking about distinct attributes, because they are different in kind from one another, that means that as essence, insofar as they constitute the nature of substance, they are ultimately identical, because it's one substance. So sooner or later, you reach the point where the single substance is a perfect unity, and those distinct attributes, all of a different kind, insofar as they constitute the substance, they are one thing, and that is the substance itself, you know?
Yeah, and he makes it very clear in 2P7. That's where he goes on a long explanation. He says that that the different attributes are just one and the same thing, and looked at in two different ways.
Yeah, that's another idea that we should return to when you're finished your exposition, Blake, is this notion about a notion of how attributes have, how they are determined insofar as the intellect perceives the essence of the that's something that we should return to before the end of this meeting. But go ahead, I don't want to interrupt you any further.
Okay. Let me see. Am I on P13 or yeah, I think I am on P13. A substance which is absolutely infinite is indivisible. Well, you know, before I get to his demonstrations, it's indivisible, obviously, because if things can start to interact, then the idea of separateness is just an illusion. It's a convenience. It's a practicality. It's not a fact, you know, that these things are completely separate. Just like the ocean and the wave. You're looking at the wave, and it's convenient for us to talk about the wave, but it's really just the ocean going around. And the same thing with the banana example that I gave. So his demonstration covered P5, which is you can't have two substances, which he proves, and which I presume you covered, and then P11, which God necessarily exists. So therefore, you must have one substance. There's no doubt about that. And it's infinitely indivisible. or it's not indivisible, is because it's one thing. So it's convenience to look at things as separate things. Another good example might be a pregnant woman. You know, there's one person there, and then after she gives birth, there's two people there. You know, okay, does that make sense?
Yeah. Let's ask, David has a remark to make.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we're sort of saying that because we can't conceive of anything that is another substance, because it would necessarily stand in relationship to the one substance. It would have some attribute, and then the substance which we conceived as God wouldn't be the absolute with every attribute, and therefore was limited in some way, right? So we can't conceive of a second substance. That's our conceptual framework, right? So,
Yeah.
so it seems to be a limitation more on thinking than on what is or is real. But
Yeah.
we're only taking what we can conceive as the whole discussion, right? That's true. That it
Yeah.
has to be something conceivable. Otherwise, we're talking about nonsense, right?
Right.
Yeah. But on the other hand, we're talking about attributes that we have no concept of. There must be other attributes which we can't intelligibly make any sense of there being any attributes. So we know nothing about them. We can't conceive of anything. It's just we've said there are, like saying there's a square triangle. Well, how do we assert there are these other attributes? In what sense are they? Exist? There are other. What does that mean?
Right. The reason you can't understand them is because our brain has certain capacities.
No, but that was the problem with substance. We can't conceive because we have certain capacities. We can't think of another substance that doesn't interact. That's a conceptual problem with us, right?
Well, think about it this way. If, first of all, in Spinoza's time, or in his mind, the universe went on forever. And if you get in a rocket ship and you start traveling far enough, you're just observing more and more of this single substance because you're interacting with all of it. And if it goes on for infinity, there's no end to it. And it necessarily takes up all that there could possibly be. Now, if it was limited, it'd have to be limited by something else of the same type. And the example Spinoza gives is you can't limit a book with a thought, and you can't limit a thought with a book. You know, you need another book or an end of a book or something something physical to limit of something other physical. And you need a thought to go one thought to another thought. So you need something that borders it and limits it. And so what he's showing is that there's nothing that borders or limits God, because then that's just something else that's part of God, because it's something interacting with him.
Yeah, I think that what David was getting at was something entirely different. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that what David's asking is that we have a concept, and he's talking about the inability to conceive of the infinity of other attributes, for example, and yet implied in these concepts is being itself. In other words, Spinoza is beginning with ideas and moving into existence. And is this correct, David? And the question is, how can we talk about what determines the nature of being on the basis of ideas that we are incapable of understanding or conceiving?
Yeah, that's kind of where I was coming from. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of problems. I was listening, but that was one I could state. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it, Robert.
You see, because one of the things I find most interesting about this is that the correlation between thought and being in Spinoza is established very early on, and that is, and I can't overemphasize this, and I'm certainly open to refutation on this point, but it seems to me that what he's saying is that if you have something that essentially exists, what you're talking about is an idea that necessarily implies the being of something. In other words, You can talk ordinarily in the classical world, people would say, describe it for me, define it for me. And they would say, these are the essential attributes of this thing. And then you could say, after you have demonstrated that it is, these are indeed the essential attributes, and there's no contradiction in the being that you're describing, then you could ask, now, does it exist? Right? You don't assume that simply providing a definition, in other words, enumerating the essential attributes of any given thing, that it exists. But in the case of Spinoza, what he's saying is that there is something with an essence of existence. So in other words, there's a formal explanation for the being of something. So if we can understand that the essence of substance necessarily involves being, actual existence, then we can just safely assume that it quite necessarily has being. It's unavoidable. But that's something that he relies on throughout the ethics, that fundamental premise that I can conceive of something that necessarily has being in the world. My conception is an idea. The being is the reality of the thing. And he's saying that my understanding of the essence implies of necessity the being of that thing, in this case, substance. So I'm not sure whether I hit it on the nail, but that's what I hope to everyone sort of understands. Formal cause is something radically different from efficient cause, and teleological cause as well, needless to say. Teleological cause is not something that Spinoza is willing to entertain even for a moment, but formal cause is something that I think is something that Spinoza relies on a great deal. And so, again, I've not actually addressed David's point, but I just did the best I could. Sorry, Ella, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you developed, because I had a follow-up thought very similar to David's, and I think you did answer my question, but I'll go ahead and ask it just because I'm not sure. Okay, so under the definition D3 and D4, D3 by substance, I understand what it is in itself and is conceived through itself. That is, that whose concept does not require the concept of another thing from which it must be formed. D4, by attribute, this is what I'm honing in on as well as David. By attribute, I understand what the intellect perceives of a substance as constituting its essence. Now, when I read through that definition, I underlined intellect and perceives. So basically, from what you just said, Robert, and also I must say, Blake, I think you covered this as well, but I was unsure, so I'm asking the question: everything is one substance in the universe, which is God or nature, but our intellect, and I understand when it comes to attributes, one can cancel out the other, etc. So, but my question is it our intellect that, and our perception of a substance that is constituting its essence? That is, our intellect limits our understanding of the infinite, of God and nature. And so it's our limited ability to understand it, basically. Is that the case?
Okay, we understand your question. And I could go to town on that in response to your question, because I think that it's crucial that everybody understands this correctly, this definition, and what the significance of intellect perceives of. Okay, that is something that everyone really ought to understand, but correctly. But let somebody else comment on this first.
Well, first of all, it's something you perceive as constituting its essence. So I think of, my mind is capable of understanding thought and extension. So I think that the thing that makes up substance is thought and extension. I think of it as being extension, things I can touch, things I can feel, things I can see, stuff like that, and thought, ideas that I have. So those are the ways that I can perceive God or nature. That's those are the things that I can perceive. Like I said, I can't perceive radio waves, but I can receive or I can perceive those other two. So it says here by attribute. So that's what we're talking about, is by attribute. I understand that what the intellect, what the brain perceives of a substance as constituting its essence. So the stuff that makes up God seems to me to be either extension or thought. You see?
Okay. Anybody else want to
Yes,
take a
thank you.
stab at this? Because what you see, one thing that I think that has to be understood is that in that definition, you could understand that to mean that there is substance, and whether or not it has essential attributes, this is the way that intellect perceives it. So in other words, it's just like the phenomenal world in Kant as opposed to the noumenal world. The being of substance is one thing. The mind perceives something that may or may not be true of substance. Okay? Maybe substance, according to the way, one way of understanding this definition is to say, this is the way that the intellect perceives substance, but it's not true. I think that's quite clearly false, right? The other way of understanding is to simply say that this is the way that intellect perceives substance, and indeed it's true. Substance does have essential attributes, and the human mind can perceive both extension and thinking in substance as being essential attributes, right? And so that's another way of understanding it, right? So I just want to ask, to begin with, is everyone at least in agreement that, I mean, it take a long time for me to demonstrate, in a sense, that what Spinoza does mean, indeed, is that the mind is making a true perception of substance when it attributes the essential attributes of extension and also thinking, in addition to the infinity of other attributes. The intellect here is not a limited intellect, constituting the nature of the infinite intellect that is substance. That would just be completely at odds with the natural, the dependency of the world follows an order from the infinite substance to limited substances. Our minds are limited. So to make our limited minds with limited perceptions the principle by which you define and determine the nature of the infinite substance would be completely backwards, right? The dependency always goes from the infinite to the finite. So is that a clear point, Ella? I won't stress that point any further. Go ahead,
Yes.
James. James?
Yeah, so I understand that we can, you prove that the concept of substance is extension and thought, but that you can also say that that's a finite understanding, right? So how do you get from the finite to the infinite to God? Isn't that a speculation then?
No,
Well, go ahead, Blake.
he shows throughout the propositions that we've already covered that one thing has to be limited by another thing of the same type. And so therefore, if God was limited, there'd have to be another substance that would limit God. Otherwise, God is infinite. And he shows that there's only one God that extends infinitely because there's no other substance that limits it. And so that there's only one. Does it make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, because you're extrapolating from the concept understanding of substance as these based on these two attributes, right? Extension and thought.
Right. Now,
But how do you get from that to the idea of God, which is an infinite?
right. Well, he's not going from attributes to God. He's going from the idea of limiting substances, limiting something of a same type by something of another thing of the same type. And he's trying to join the ideas of thought and extension because, like I said, Descartes had them as separate things. And he's trying to show that it's the same thing. It's one thing. So Spinoza doesn't run into the problem of how the ideas move the hand or something like that. He doesn't run into that problem because he shows that it's all related. It's all one thing.
Okay.
James, let me see if I can respond as well to what you just said. Essentially, the question that you're asking is, how do we go from limited perception, right, in our own minds, our own limited intellect? How can an limited intellect arrive at a definition where the substance itself and the essential attributes are infinite? How can a limited mind conceive of an infinite object, right?
Right. That's exactly
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So in a very interesting way, the intellect that we use to determine the infinite, the infinity of the substance and the infinite essential attributes, that even though it's limited in its nature, because our mind is just a mode, right? That thought, that conception can be absolutely identical with that of an infinite intellect. In other words, it's an adequate idea, and for Spinoza, of course, adequate means absolutely true, right? A complete, comprehensive, and true concept in terms of its conception of any given object, right? That's an adequate idea for Spinoza, and that adequate idea, in order for an idea to be adequate, it means that it's not an error due to limitation in any shape or form, right? So in other words, when our minds properly conceive of the necessity of the infinity, the absolute infinity of substance, it is completely and absolutely correct, despite the fact that we have a limited. It's like, in other words, the conception that God himself would form of his infinite nature as substance, they would be identical.
Okay.
Our thought is identical to the thought that God would have with respect to the necessity of the infinity of his nature.
Let me add to that. In his book on the improvement of understanding, he gives an analogy that I think is apt. It's not possible for a man to lift something that's 5,000 pounds, right? But we can, through a lot of effort, build a crane and then use that crane to lift the 5,000 pounds, right? So we have to have certain initial capabilities to start to build the crane. We had to have sufficient, basis, sufficient beginning point to be able to build the crane so that we can lift the 5,000 pounds. So what we're trying to do is prove God's existence and understand God, which is the 5,000 pound thing. And the steps that we build to use the crane are these propositions, so that we're slowly using our intellect. And he shows that we have the necessary requirement intellectually to understand it. It's just that we need to build it a step at a time, which is what the ethics does. You know, it has the definitions, the axioms, the proofs, and it's essentially, as we're going through these, we're building the crane, and then the crane is lifting the 5,000 pounds, which is the proof of God's existence. So what you got to do is, your mind may not be like right off the cuff understanding the whole concept, but you are smart enough to understand definition 1, and then you definition 2 and axiom, and you work on it and you work through these propositions, and then eventually you build up the machinery that proves the point.
And the other thing, I think that what Blake is saying here is that not only are we capable of understanding that substance is absolutely infinite, but the propositions, the way that they unfold, show that it is impossible for us to conceive of substance as being limited. Like, if you understand the nature of substance and you examine what the nature of substance actually is, you cannot help, you could not fail to recognize that it is necessarily infinite, that it necessarily is not limited by any other thing. And that's an example of how a limited human intellect can recognize a truly complete, comprehensive idea of the nature of substance, insofar as that it is infinite, right? We recognize the necessity of the infinity of substance based on our own rational capacity. And really, the demonstration shows that it's impossible to understand substance in any other way.
So basically, you're saying that the rational mind has this ability to understand, to comprehend the notion of infinity.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
But before, I was saying, when you're talking about the implications of reading the definition, attribute is what I understand intellect to perceive, that raises the question, and apparently Wolfson is somebody that entertained this idea, which seems to me to be almost insanely absurd that anyone could entertain this idea, but nevertheless, he thought that, well, that seems to suggest that substance is not necessarily infinite, or the nature of the attributes is not something that is actually true of substance. It's just the way that intellect perceives it. That's something different. That would mean that you would talk about the limited capacity of the intellect to perceive determining the nature of substance, whereas substance is infinite, and the intellect of necessity, our own intellects, our capacity to perceive, is limited. And perception here, we're talking about not obviously anything like sense perception. We're talking about the capacity to conceive of, to form a concept in our mind, right? I really have to stop talking so much. I want to hear from other people anyway. Anybody else?
Okay, so let me see. I have the proof, the demonstration. We were talking about E1 P14 demonstration. And the first point is definition 6, which is substance containing an infinite number of attributes. So that no substance can be, except God, no substance can be conceived, because there's God contains all of the attributes. That's the point. Okay, then it says, if there were another substance, it would have to explain through an attribute. And since there cannot be two substances with the same attribute, and definition 6, there cannot be another substance. So he's going through a lot of explanations of why there's not another substance, that there is only one, which is God. It's a singular thing. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then E1 P15. Whatever is in God, and nothing can be conceived without God. So since there's only one God, and God is infinite in the sense of not just extending infinite direction, but infinite meaning everything, then if there's anything you see, it's automatically part of God. It interrelates with you. If you could see it or conceive it or anything, it's related and it's part of this this single whole. So his demonstration is that only one substance, and by D5, all modes are affections of substance. So that's why it makes sense. And let's look at D5 real quick. D5, by mode, I understand the affections of a substance. So that means that a mode is just really, you know, a subset or a little part of substance, or that which is in another through which it is conceived. So therefore, there's only one God, one whole, and we're all just part of this one whole. So that anything that you can think of or anything that you could imagine that exists has to exist within God. That's the point of P15. Clear as mud, right?
Yeah, you know, in P5, just to return to this notion of like, why should there not be two substances with the same attribute? And I think that the identity of indiscernibles is one of those principles that all the modernist rationalist philosophers relied on. And that is, if you're talking about something and you want to create a definition for a substance and you define it with a single attribute, and then you say there's also this other substance and it has the same attribute, then it's quite naturally you would say, well, we're talking about the same thing, the one substance with the same attribute. That's just the same thing. Why are you why is there two? You know, how could you even distinguish between? We're talking about one thing when you talk about one attribute. That's just by the way. Sorry. Okay, we can continue now, Blake.
Okay. Well, I don't have much more if we were going to stop at P15. So is there any like discussion we can have and talk about some more of these details?
Well, P15, one of the examples that he offers is the infinity. He's using the infinity of numbers as an example, and he also uses the infinity of lines, right? And one of the examples he offers here, the third example, is if we conceive that from one point of a certain infinite quantity, two lines, say A and B and A and C, and they're extended to infinity, he says, it is certain that although in the beginning they are a certain and determinate distance apart, the distance between B and C is continuously increased, and at last from being determinate, it will become indeterminable. And I didn't understand that. I thought to myself, well, why should extending these lines that are going off at an angle, they're going off at an angle, so therefore you can measure the distance between the two lines at any single point, and they go to infinity, why does the distance between these two lines become indeterminable at any point?
Well, certainly if they're extending indeterminately or infinitely, then obviously their distance is going to be infinite, right? Because they're going further apart as you go. So if they go infinitely long, then they're going to be infinitely apart, right? Indeterminably apart.
Oh, you're saying that infinite and indeterminable are equivalent terms here. What I thought it meant was that regardless of the fact that they were infinite, at any point in the distance along any one line, that somehow the distance between that same point, between the point at AB and AC, regardless of where you drew that point, to draw a distance between the two lines, that it would be indeterminable. And that didn't seem to me to be necessary at all. Like, why should they become indeterminable?
Right. Let me read this real quick. If corporeal substance is infinite, they say, let us conceive it to be divided in two parts. Each part will be either infinite or finite. If the former, then an infinite is composed of two finite parts. which is absurd. If the latter, then there is one infinite twice as large as another, which is also absurd. Again, so I'm wondering if I get a line, oh, then, and therefore one infinite number will be 12 times greater than the other. Finally, if we conceive that from one point of a certain infinite quantity, two lines, say A and B and A and C, okay, so this is the part you were talking about, are extended to infinity, it is certain that although in the beginning they are certain determinate distances apart, the distance between B and C is continuously increasing, and at last, from being determinate, it will become indeterminate. So it's not saying that it's indeterminate at every level. It's saying it's indeterminate at the end, which is what I was talking about.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that makes good sense. Yeah, 15 is a very elaborate, and he talks about he provides a lot of different not proofs, but refutations of ordinary understandings of the nature of substance, especially, for example, when people would complain that you can't attribute extension to God because that would mean that he would be something that could suffer effects of one kind or another. And of course, for Spinoza, God is subject to effects of all kinds. That's what modes are, modifications of the single substance, so that that's the nature of the world, right?
Right, but God himself is just an expression of himself and is not affected by other things.
Not affected by other things, no. That's right. And
We're just ultimately, the modes are just expressions of God.
yeah.
Just like my kidney is an expression of Blake McBride.
Yeah. We can look at Proposition 18, which I think is a very it's addresses that point, and that is that God is the immanent, not the transitive cause of all things.
Right.
So everyone understands the distinction between transitive and immanent cause, right?
Right, because transitive, that's like the Judeo-Christian God, which comes, creates, and then goes somewhere else or is in a separate place. The immanent cause is something that's like the clay is what is the immanent cause of the bowl. It's the substance that it's made of. It's the formal clause.
Oh, I wouldn't put it in those terms. I wouldn't say that it was the substance that the bowl is made of. It's not the clay. It's the immanent cause, and I'm speaking of Spinoza now, in particular, the immanent cause, when he identifies that with God, what he's saying is that God is the formal cause, or the explanation. If you think of cause as being explanation, then the explanation has to lie in the essential nature of God himself, right? So that's where you would have well, actually, a bowl is a modification, right? So it gets a little bit complicated. But actually, I'm going to rely on you here, Blake, because I'm not sure whether I could do this justice. But how do we distinguish between the essential attributes which are infinite, right? And let's just say extension or thought, whichever you prefer, either extension or thought. What is the relation between the essential attributes and modifications, modes, in either of the attributes?
Well, we're all part of God, this one substance, right? And the mind can only perceive two attributes, thought and extension. So we perceive these modes in terms of thought and extension, which is obvious. I mean, if you anything you describe to me is either going to be a thought or something that exists, or potentially exists. There's no other way we can really conceive of anything.
Okay, but how does the explanation for a mode a modification. I'm going to stick to thought. Okay, let's stick to extension because it'd probably be easier to think about. If you think of the infinite extension of the infinite attribute of extension, that just means nothing really other than something that occupies space, right? That occupies space. That's its essential attribute. It can how it occupies space can take a whole variety of different forms. So I can just offer an analogy here. No, I won't even resort to analogy. It's clear enough that extension occupies space. It doesn't matter what you fill the space with, right? And in Spinoza, of course, there are no gaps in space. There's a plenum. That means it extends to infinity, right? And so, but when you talk about a modification under the attribute of extension, how does that modification happen in extension? How do you have a different kind of occupation of space?
Well, think about a loaf of bread. And you look at the little particles in there, and these particles are not the same. There's different shapes and different chemical elements and whatever, but it's all one part of the bread. You see? So when you look at God, God is not a flat, opaque, it's not a flat thing, just like a blue thing that just exists. It's got all these little parts, and those little parts are what we recognize as individuals, you, me, so on and so forth. So and we do that for convenience, because it's very convenient to think of us separately, and each of the things separately that you can manipulate ultimately to your own advantage. But really, these are just parts of the whole.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll try to answer my own question the way that I understand it. That ultimately we will get to. We're anticipating the second part now, but for Spinoza, the primary mode of modification, if I can put it in those terms, the things take form under the attribute of extension. The way that one thing can be distinguished from another thing is via motion. Motion is the fundamental determining factor.
Well, because parts move together.
Pardon?
The parts move together. So when I
Yeah.
move, my legs move, the whole thing. And that's how we differentiate one mode from another.
Yeah.
But that's just a matter of convenience. I mean, it's like the steering wheel in the car. We consider it all part of the car until we take the steering wheel out of the car. Then we consider it something separate. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So as long as it moves together, we consider it one thing.
Yeah.
That's just a convenience that man uses, because it's very convenient for us to think of things that way.
Yeah.
Like the ocean, all those particles of water are moving in a way that makes us look like one wave, and we can measure the wave, and we can calculate its destructive force on the shore, and so it's very practical to treat it as if it was an individual thing.
Yeah. And the wave, a wave, you can spot a wave and identify a wave and say that is one wave. That wave takes that form because the water in that wave has assumed a different pattern of motion, and that's what forms the wave, right? So, like, water's actually a pretty good
Example.
illustration of the way that because it seems counterintuitive that my glass is fundamentally nothing except a different motion, an instance or moment of different motion under the attribute of extension. It's like, I don't know about that, but if you think of, like, for example, if we assume for a moment that a body of water is substance under the attribute of extension, and if you think of water freezing, well, what happens is the motion that is the water, like fluid water, the motion slows down, right? It becomes very, very relative to the water in a liquid form. It slows down and it becomes rigid. So now that you've changed something altogether, so you can distinguish an ice cube in a glass of water because the water that constitutes that ice cube is distinguished from the liquid water because the motion is different. It is a radically different kind of motion. And then if you take water and it's fluid and you put it on a pot and you boil the water and it goes up in steam, now the motion is changed again. So the nature of the substance, I'm using an analogy here as water, the nature of the substance under the attribute of extension has accelerated so much that now you see and experience a different phenomena altogether, but it's still fundamentally the same substance, which in this case, by analogy, is water. So, so that's just, and motion is something that you would think, it took me a long time to accept that, but ultimately we will discover when we get into book 2 a very, does Spinoza not provide a detailed explanation? I don't know whether, I'm not sure whether he does provide a detailed explanation. I'm not sure whether or not he wants to, or that he thinks that it's important that he should offer a detailed explanation, but his general explanation under the attribute of extension is motion, and everything can be distinguished according to a different kind of motion. And when you say motion, you're talking about patterns of motion, the degree of motion, like in other words, the velocity of motion, and all kinds of different things that change the quality of extension in one place or another. So that objects form that we can distinguish and identify as being a discrete entity within the realm of space. So
Right. The way we differentiate one mode from another is by motion and rest.
yeah.
Roger?
So yeah, thanks. So I'm trying to understand whether modes do arise as a result of a successive change over time. That's a bit what you were talking about. So if I take or maybe not over time, if I take a piece of dough, let's say, it has definite attributes. I understand that. And by mode, shall we say that I can make that dough into a ball? I can make it into an ellipsoid. I can make it into a cube. So are these the different modes we're talking about of the same extensive object?
No, it's different shapes of the same mode. So it's still the same individual thing. It's like when you sail a ship, even though the ship is moving, it's still one thing that we're talking about, one mode. And so when you have a bundle of clay, that's one mode, that's one thing. So it moves around together, and then you reshape it into something else. It's still that same mode. It's just in a different shape.
So what's a mode then in that case?
Well, I would consider the word mode to mean individual thing.
Mm.
So a mode, my house is a mode, I'm a mode, my glass is a mode, all these things are modes. But it's more of a convenience than an actual thing, because none of these exist by themselves. They're part of God, and so therefore they could transform. Like I said, the banana story about, when you eat a banana, it becomes part of you. So the actual delineation between one mode and another is fuzzy.
Yeah, I think that idea of the wave in the ocean is a good way of viewing it for me, in that the wave looks like a particular wave, but it's It's a part of the ocean.
Yeah.
So, and the bread analogy, you know, we're all a part of a loaf of bread, but we can only see the little individual crumbs or particles. So that was helpful.
Good.
Modification of the modification of the substance is very important, because you see, if you think of the one substance and you think of your own mind, right? Well, your own mind, let's leave aside the brain and everything else for the time being, but your mind is in the same substance, right? I mean, when you say that that thinking is an essential attribute of the substance, that means that everywhere that there is substance, and that is everywhere in the world, there is thinking. There's always thinking. So there is thinking, and I don't think this is an exaggeration. It's not an exaggeration at all to simply say that mere space has got a degree of thinking going on. You know, a rock
The
has
important
thinking.
Right. The thing that's important is that everything you just said is true, but it's important to differentiate between human thought and the thought that a rock has, because they're really just patterns. So there's a pattern going on in my head, and we call that human thought. But there's a pattern of, you know, a chemical pattern or a physical pattern of what's going on inside the rock, which is what we're calling the rock with respect to the or under the attribute of thought.
Yeah.
So that each thing, and then Spinoza talks about thought with respect to God and thought with respect to a person. And when he's talking about thought with respect to the person, he's thinking about what's going on in your head. When he talks about thought with respect to God, he's talking about the relationship between the attribute of extension and the attribute of thought. So he says that there's never an error with respect to God, with thought with respect to God, because the patterns of the rock and the physical makeup of the rock are one and the same thing. They never disagree, right?
Yeah.
But now when I'm thinking about Robert, that is error prone, because I only know a small number of things about Robert. I know he's a human being, a male. I know he lives on Earth, you know, all these things. And so I have some patterns in my head that are reflective of the idea of Robert, but it's error prone because I don't know everything about him. And I couldn't. It is impossible, because it takes all of Robert to understand Robert fully. Yeah. So so therefore you can see why with respect to God there's never an error, but with respect to a man there is.
Yeah. But I that's all very true. What I was going to get to was just simply to point out to Ella that your mind is a modification of God himself under the attribute of thinking, a single discrete modification, and it has a place in time, right? God is in eternity, but insofar as your mind is a moment, or a modification rather, it forms a moment. In other words, it has duration from the point of view of the modification itself, but not from the point of view of God, because he's eternal. So everything's happening simultaneously in God, right? So, but then when you think of your mind as being a modification, if you form an idea in your mind, a singular idea, let me say that I want you to think of a red fox, right? Now you've formed a modification of the modification. Your mind is a modification, and now you formed another modification, because when you form an idea of the fox, your entire mind isn't consumed in the idea of a fox. It's just you can treat it as an object, an imaginary object in your mind, and contemplate it. You retain self-consciousness, right? If you were absolutely lost in the conception of a red fox, then I don't think I would be going out on a limb if I were to say that you would become a red fox. I'm just kidding you. But something like that happens. Okay, so you would mistake yourself for a red fox if you didn't have self-consciousness. In other words, if it was an absolute conception that consumed all your mind. So these are the kinds of things that come up that'll be readily available to any of you to understand and recognize as being true once you get a pretty good grip on how Spinoza uses the single substance to account for individual minds, your body, all kinds of things. Sense experience is a very peculiar thing in Spinoza. So there's one thing that I want to sort of ask the group in general, and that is, hasn't anyone come up with any sort of puzzles throughout on of God, the first section here? I said there's so many different things that I remember having so much difficulty understanding when I first read the ethics, that I'm surprised that people don't have any questions about this first section.
Right. Well, this doesn't.
I don't. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I don't want to do live readings, but I will resort to live readings to show some of the more interesting ideas that show up here. Go ahead. What were you going to say, Blake?
I was going to say that, we're not done with part one yet. And Spinoza goes at great length in part one to talk about determinism and things that get caused and what God, because God has a certain freedom that modes don't have, because modes are entirely causally determined. There's no other element. There's no real freedom element. God is an expression of himself. So there's nothing outside of God determining what God does. So while we are entirely controlled by external forces, ultimately, God is not. So the things that God does, it's free in the sense, God is free in the sense that nothing makes God do anything. Everything is just a free expression of God. Now,
Right.
God doesn't have any like ends in mind or anything like that, but he just does what he wants to do, or not does what he wants to do, does what as he unfolds his natural ability. It's a little bit like being 1 year old and eating food and living your life. The evolution of your body just happens automatically. It just evolves by itself. You don't have to consciously think of it, and you don't have to do anything on purpose or anything like that. You just have to, your body becomes just your expression of your initial start as soon as you were born or whatever before that. And all the things that happen to you physically are just a progression of your natural expression. And for God, it's the same way, that this whole thing is just a natural progression. Now, God is not free in the sense, we and God are not free in the sense that we could just arbitrarily choose to do something different. So God can't say, oh, well, today I'm going to do this or that. God doesn't do that. It's just like the development of my body. I never decided I'm going to grow 2 arms or 3 arms instead of 2 or anything like that. It just kind of happened, and it happened naturally. It wasn't some kind of like decision that was made. So
Right.
This is some of the stuff that he goes into in the remainder of part one.
Yeah, I think it's important, to recognize that the necessity prevails through all of substance and all of the world. There's never anything that happened. There's no contingency of any kind, shape, or form in Spinoza. But we have to distinguish between formal cause in terms of God and his essential attributes, and the efficient causes that prevail through the world that we know, right? All modifications are moments in a continuous chain of cause and effect relations. And these causes and effects are efficient causes and effects, right? So that is it's a little bit complicated to deal with how modifications take place in the essential attributes, under any one of the essential attributes. Because when you talk about the essential attribute, you're not talking about distinguishing cause and effect through any other attribute. Essentially, what you're talking about is the same substance. So it's happening with all the substances simultaneously, but we understand it under one attribute. So let's just say, for example, if you're thinking about thoughts, well, every thought that passes through your mind is an effect of a previous thought, which is the cause. And that cause that caused that effect is also understood to be, can also be regarded as an effect which followed from another previous cause. Now, the thing that's interesting in Spinoza is that when a cause has an effect, the effect that follows from that cause is absolutely determined. It follows from that cause, the effect follows from that cause with absolute necessity. And when you talk about the principle of sufficient reason, Spinoza would say that if I'm talking about an idea as an effect now, I have an idea and what caused that? He's going to say that according to the principle of sufficient reason, I can offer a complete, comprehensive explanation for that idea passing through your mind. Now, because it's under the attribute of thinking, it was necessarily caused by previous thoughts, right? Other thoughts that you've had. You never have a spontaneous thought, and never have a thought by accident. You never have a creative thought in the true sense, where I choose to create some sort of concept in my mind, determined by me, myself alone. No, it follows of necessity from all the other thoughts previous to that thought that we are now regarding as a cause or as an effect. And so that is something that's worth noting, is that when you talk about substance, and for example, the existence of God, that is a formal cause. It follows from the essence of God. But in the case of modes, modifications of those essential attributes, that's always follows from efficient. That is subject to efficient causation. There's always like a billiard ball, that kind of thing, you know. Except that it's imminent as opposed to transitive.
Yeah, what you're really talking about is natura naturans versus natura naturata.
Exactly. Yeah.
Natura naturata is cause and effect, the modal cause effect. You know, this happens and happens causes that. And natura naturans is seeing the whole thing as one solid thing, and you're only seeing a slice of this thing at a time. But it's really a solid thing that can't be changed. So the past is in stone, and so is the future in stone. You just don't see it. Right. So in a sense, what's interesting is that what we perceive to be causal effects in natura naturata turn out to be just a shape in natura naturans.
Yeah.
So when you talk about why is gravity the force that it is, and why are all these laws of physics the way they are, because there's a certain shape to God, and that shape is determining what those numbers are, the strength of gravity, the all the different mathematical constants in the universe. You know, they're all determined by this shape. And then the individual parts in it we're looking at as events. What book is that?
This is the ethics. I was just looking at what we're talking about here is, you know, what the absolute nature of God, those are the essential attributes. So propositions 21 deal with the necessity that prevails through the essential attributes, and then 22 shows that it's everything follows of necessity from the nature of God. And then in 23, he distinguishes the modes that follow of necessity as well, and are infinite, but infinite in a sequence. at least from a certain point of view, because, of course, for God himself, if you just imagine as God himself as being, you know, a singular mind, from his point of view, everything is happening simultaneously. And so, yeah, those propositions starting at around 21 through to about 30, to 30, shows the necessity that prevails through the world on every level. But there's different kinds of necessity, some efficient causes, some formal causes. But you have to read that to know what it entails. That just shows that, in a sense, God doesn't have any freedom. He doesn't
Right.
have any freedom because he doesn't. Everything follows from his nature of necessity. So everything that,
Yeah, freedom kind of means that he could have done something different.
which God couldn't have done anything differently, right?
If you
The
look
only
at it-
reason he can be regarded as being free is to say that something like, let's just say, just by way of analogy here, I'm always very cautious about using analogies, but I think in this case it works, is to simply say there are certain laws of nature. God is subject to those laws of nature, but
Or
they are his own laws, right? They're his own. So he's sort of a self-legislating.
right, he's not subject to any laws. He creates the laws. You know, the laws are evolved from God.
Yeah,
Right.
he is, in a sense, the laws. You know, he
Right.
is the laws. So it's strange to talk about him being subject to the laws. He is the law. God is the laws of nature. But again, those laws of nature, even if you think about things of like, I would hesitate to start talking about things like the law of gravity or something like that. And they're in no way equivalent with the essential attributes of God, right? Modes
Yeah.
and latency. I don't
Gravity
understand what them.
mode, because he talks about finite modes and infinite modes. So finite modes are you, me, the glass, the computer, whatever. Infinite modes are things that are just pervasive throughout God, like the law of gravity, like numeric laws, pi, the ratio of pi, you know, all those things are infinite modes. And
Yeah,
they're all a product of God as well. They're all, you know, an expression of God, is the best way to put it. Yeah.
yeah.
It's a little like my arms weren't calculated to be a certain ratio with my legs or my body or anything. They were just an expression of my evolution, you know, of my development, of my becoming an adult.
Yeah. So actually, before I get to you, James, very quickly, Proposition 24 addresses this. The essence of things produced by God does not involve existence. And this is evident from D1. So there are things that part of their essence is not existence. Existence is not the essence of these things. This is evident from D1. From that whose nature involves existence, considered in itself, is its own cause and exists only from the necessity of its nature. If something has existence in its essence, then it has always existed and it always will. It's impossible for it not to have being in the world, right? But the corollary here, from this it follows that God is not only the cause of things beginning to exist, but also of their persevering in existing, or to use scholastic terms, God is the cause of the being of things. For whether the things exist or not, so long as we attend to their essence, we shall find that it involves neither existence nor duration. The essence of a thing doesn't have duration. I find that very interesting, that notion that duration is not part of the essence of anything. So their essence can be the cause neither of their existence nor of their duration, but only God can be the cause of their existence and duration, to whose nature alone it pertains to exist, can be the cause. Now, very quickly, let's go to James. I have another question about that proposition, but go ahead, James.
Yeah, you're talking about the God is a deterministic being, but is he also, you mentioned that he creates the laws, right? So is there an element of creativity in God?
No, God is the laws. He is the laws. If you took
Right,
away
right.
the
But
laws, you would lose God. Right?
yeah, but if he's subject to his own laws that he created, then he's limiting his own creativity, right? He's limiting his own omnipotence.
I shouldn't have said what I said. Okay, God didn't create the laws. God is identical with the laws.
Okay,
The laws
identical with
are
the laws.
God. Yeah.
Right, right.
God, so God wasn't there first and then created the laws. God and the laws are identical and have always been eternal.
Okay.
Have always, are eternal. Period.
Right, but if he's an infinite God, then he's not gonna limit himself to certain laws that he originally created.
Well, he's
So
not such.
Listen, Spinoza's God is. There's a lot of things that he may not like, but he's absolutely. You know what I mean? God's got no choice about the nature that he is. God has got no choice.
right.
God is a substance that is infinite, and he has an infinity of attributes, and he's got no choice about those things. That's just who and what he is.
Right, but if he's an omnipotent God, then he's not going to limit himself to anything that he had done before. So, I mean, isn't God also defined as a kind of by creativity as well?
No.
Think of a loaf of bread on a table. So the loaf of bread is what the loaf of bread is.
Mhm.
And if you say, well, it could be anything it wants. No, it is what it is. That's not, it could be anything it wants. The loaf of bread doesn't decide, oh, I'm going to be this shape or that shape, and it's not free to make decisions. This loaf of bread is just the expression of the whole piece of the whole loaf of bread.
Right, right. So it's just like exactly what Einstein believed, because he loves Spinoza, that God does not play dice. But human beings do play dice and do play games of chance and so forth, and do create artistically. And so there's some element of creativity, right?
It seems like creativity. It's kind of like when you play pool and you hit some balls on the table and they scatter and you think it's random, but there's nothing random about it at all. It's just a consequence of the cause and effect of the force and the friction and the weight of the balls and all that kind of stuff. So when you look at the creativity, the kind of creativity you're talking about, like what an artist does, it seems creative because you didn't like intend to do that particular thing, or it just kind of came to you. But whatever you did was always a consequence of prior events. So they were all a logical consequence. It wasn't like, oh well, I was extra creative and I created this thing. No, well, from the beginning of time, you were bound to do that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Ella, go ahead.
If God is infinite, then there would be no limitation on no need for repetition of the same laws that existed. Of course, there's some certain laws, but then the notion of creativity is that you can come up with something new, and so so God as a creative being would be constantly creating something new, in addition to the laws that have been there. But
God is
even laws
constantly.
change, right? But even
God is
laws change
constant.
as well.
God is constantly creating. That is true. He's constantly creating a new world, but according to laws that dictate what he creates. They determine what he creates.
Well, he's the one that creates those laws.
He creates those laws, but
the laws are a product of God. They're just like I'm of God. So it isn't like all the different pieces, you, me, and all these different modes create God. That's not the way it works. It's the other way around. God exists and we're just parts of this thing that God is. So the laws are exactly the same way. The laws don't create God, and God is not subject to any of the laws. But the expression of God is one of the in terms of infinite modes, that's the expression of God, or what the laws are.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, one of the expressions of God might be us as human beings who are also creative because we,
Yeah, but
yeah.
but James, if you really were to press Spinoza on this point, he would say that if you think of creativity as being autonomous, spontaneous, and unique expressions that have not been determined in any way by anything outside of you, like in other words, you're absolutely autonomous, Spinoza would say there's no such thing in the world. If that's what your idea of creativity is, there's no such thing in the world. Not even God is in a position. He is the furthest thing from being autonomous. God in Spinoza is his nature, and his nature is constituted by his essential attributes, which are eternal, and he's got no choice about them.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So he's it's a rational God that
Can I get in there, please, James?
Spinoza conceived of. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Based on his rational understanding of God. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, if I accept this position, and I get it, as a particle or a crumb within the loaf of bread, my understanding is, and it's very general, is that the goal is joy. Is
Right.
that, I can have joy, and this is the part I need to have clarified. Within this loaf of bread, being a particle, a crumb, I can have joy by understanding, no, by rationality, and increasing my understanding
Yes.
of the universe, of God, of the being in the loaf of bread, of being, by increasing my awareness and understanding. Is that correct?
That's correct. You can improve your understanding of the world, and that will make you happy. It's not going to change anything, but it's going to make you happy, just like Leibniz.
From the natura naturata perspective, the more you learn over time and the better understanding, the more straightforward things are. Let me give you an example. Let's say you needed an operation in order to be healthy, and you knew about it. You knew you had some kind of illness and you had to have this operation. And as a human being, you'd probably be relatively calm about it. And you'd say, okay, I need to go into this surgery. There's a high possibility that everything will be fine. And I just need to have this surgery. And so you're pretty calm because your understanding is high. You understand what the problem is and how they know how to fix it and all that. Now picture some native of some tribe somewhere, that doesn't know anything about medicine at all. And he knows enough. You got to tell him, you got to cut him open and do something. He's going to fight you with everything he's got, and he's going to have a lot of suffering, and everything's going to be miserable. I mean, it's kind of like trying to do something with your dog or something. You got to take this medicine. They don't want to take it. They don't want to take it, but because they don't understand. But as your understanding increases, you have more peace about it because you say, okay, well, I need to take this. If you fully understand determinism, then you're less fearful of the end of your life because you know that that's the way it is. It's nothing you can do about it. It's already kind of in stone. It's going to happen. Enjoy your life as much as you can, live as well as you can, but it comes to an end. So as you can see, knowledge makes things more calm because it's not a surprise. It's what it is. You don't fight something that you have no control over.
Yeah,
So,
once there's a recognition that something is inevitable, like death, for example, then in a sense, you're not quite as depressed as you would be if you thought, I'm going to die and something's wrong. I should be able to avoid this. When you realize it's unavoidable, then you go, oh, well, I guess I don't feel quite as bad as I did before, because whereas before I thought I was desperate to figure out some way to avoid dying, but now I know I'm going to die. And so, I'm not quite as desperately depressed about it, depending on how you feel about life itself, I suppose.
kind of like someone who's freakishly about, being healthy and all.
Yeah.
You want to come up to them and say, you realize that no matter what you do, you're going to die, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, you ever heard of that guy that's living in the States somewhere? He made $1 billion in, I don't know, some sort of software, and now he's doing all these things to prolong his life. And he claims to have a body of a 22-year-old, and he's actually 45 or something like that. And anyway, he spends most of his time sleeping, apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Roy Walford did tests on that stuff, and he came up with this idea of how to live a long time. And you got to eat this reduced caloric diets. And he showed how rats could live twice as long if they ate these really reduced diets. Anyway, he died about 80 years old.
Yeah. James, have you got your hand up? Did you want to say something, James, or have you just got your hand up? So anyway, listen, we're approaching the end of the meeting, and I have to say that I want to register a little bit of a concern here, and that is one thing that, for example, we can have a nice general conversation about Spinoza, and I can say this is true of Spinoza and that is not true of Spinoza, but everything that I claim to know about Spinoza, I could only derive from reading the propositions. Each of the propositions is a demonstration. Quite often, a demonstration depends on an earlier, as part of one of the premises in the argument is an accomplished and demonstrated principle from earlier in the text, right? An earlier proposition serves as a premise in the latest argument, the latest demonstration that he's making. So these things, each demonstration holds together. So if we look at, for example, Proposition 25, God is the efficient cause, not only the existence of things, but also of their essence. Then he says, on the basis of Proposition 15, this is absurd, that God would be, he's saying that if you deny this, if you were to deny it, it's absurd, because I've already proved in 15 that it's impossible that could be the case, that God could be that could be an absurd proposition. Sorry, I chose a very bad example. But many other examples, like if you look at a thing which has been determined by God to produce an effect, cannot render itself undetermined. So God has determined that a certain effect should follow from God himself, from the nature of God, a certain effect should follow. And it's impossible that anything could ever allow for this thing to be undetermined. In other words, to escape from the necessity of the divine nature. And in that proposition, he proves that with Proposition 26, 24, 21, 25, the axiom number 1 and definitions number 3 and number 5. So all of these things culminate in propositions which have more general scope. And so I just want to let everybody know that to truly understand, to read Spinoza is to grapple with each individual proposition one at a time. And you look at it and you say, is this valid? And you ask yourself, am I convinced by this argument? And the way to understand it is not only just the form of that single proposition, but the principles that he claims, that Spinoza has claimed, to provide a rational demonstration earlier in the text. That's the form of this philosophy. That's the form that it takes. That's the geometrical method, right?
Yeah, I might make one exception to that, which is that what I found is that if you progress through it linearly, like you're talking about, where you go through one part and another and prove each part and understand each part, the problem is there's a lot of the concepts have various ways of interpreting them. And if you do that, you're going to be progressing on an interpretation. And then all of a sudden you hit a proposition that says, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. So, so even though you were sure you understood a prior proposition, you probably didn't. There's probably another way of understanding that would make this following proposition be true. You see? So although it is true that they progress logically and linearly, it's not true that you can just read it one time through and get it.
No, I'm not suggesting that. What you're saying is absolutely correct. It's true. Like when you look at any single proposition, often a definition does work in that proposition that you had not seen earlier in the text. And all of a sudden it has greater power, greater explanatory power, a single definition. So everything takes on, all the definitions of propositions take on a more extensive sense according to the work that they do in any given proposition. So a proposition can depend on a principle in one way in one proposition, and that same principle has a different significance in another proposition. Not a radically different significance, but something just relatively different, or sort of more expansive in its meaning. So anyway.
Just
go ahead,
comment on that. I think that's helpful. I actually, I bought the book because it was easier for me than scrolling back to find his proofs for the propositions, the different definitions, or and so forth, like you just outlined, Robert. So, his evidence for his proofs. I found it easier to buy the book and turn and flip backwards with the pages than
absolutely
scrolling back. Yeah. It was helpful.
The PDF can drive you crazy if you keep on trying to scroll back and find an earlier proposition or one of the definitions or something like that. So if you print off the definitions and axioms and maybe the first 10 pages, you're going to save yourself a lot of grief, because you're reading, you go, what is that definition? You check, you see the definition. After a while, you just remember what the definitions were,
Yeah. But he's done all the work for you. Well, not all of the work, but a lot of the work for you, right? You just have to follow his breadcrumbs.
Spinoza does a lot of the work for you. I mean, in a way, you don't have to think. You just have to follow him, It's really true. I mean, in Spinoza, I very rarely come across an idea that is somewhat perplexing, you know what I mean? Where it's like a notion that is difficult to get a grasp on. That's very rare, at least in the early stuff, and at least in the early part 1 and part 2, you don't run into that kind of problem in Spinoza. He bandies about terms that are sometimes difficult to understand, like what is the nature of, for example, like to claim that something is infinite. You hear people in philosophy use the term infinity all the time, but infinity is not a very easy concept to get a good hold of. Sometimes we take it for granted, terms like infinity and eternity and all those things that Hume would say, when you get right down to it, we have no idea what we mean by infinity and eternity. That's what Hume would say. So that's just a bunch of nonsense, and and perhaps he's right, who knows. Anybody else have any remarks? You know what, Scott, can you hang around for a moment after this meeting, because I wanted to ask you something. And Nick, don't you have any comments that you want to make? You usually come up with something that's really difficult to deal with.
No, I mean, I thought it was a good discussion. But I guess when you said you want to register some concern, I thought something, but I thought maybe for me, if the discussion were more tied to the text, I could follow easier. That's all I.
Right. That is my concern.
Otherwise, meetup discussion could easily morph into a sociology of group therapy.
It's true. I think that the next time I lead a meeting, which I believe will be next time, I'm going to look at some propositions and I'll put them on the meetup page so everyone will know well ahead of time what propositions I want to look at, because what I'm not interested in just an exposition of the ideas or anything like that, but I want to show how the form of the propositions. I want to look at some of the interesting propositions and deal with the form. Look at how to ask, is Spinoza's argument valid? I think that is a very important thing to do, to know whether or not it's truly valid, to evaluate the validity of any given proposition. So that, I think, is something that we ought to do before we get to the ultimate culmination of this on God of God is the appendix. And in the appendix, Spinoza really comes to life, and it's a beautiful read. It's really wonderful to read, but only if you really know what he has proved of God. That's, I think, important. And clearly for the rest of the book, it's very important. It's crucial that everyone understand the basic ideas that he claims to have proved in the first part. So we'll just leave it at that, I guess, for tonight. Anybody else have anything else? I want to ask Scott something before Scott leaves.
Well, thank you, Robert, and everyone. I feel like I'm moving along. I'm getting it now. So I think the meeting was very informative, and it's interesting. He's different than Kant, and even some of the philosophers that we have done together, like Leibniz and Schelling. So it's interesting, and I think I'm moving along in understanding his philosophy. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Good night, Ella.
Yeah.
So thanks everybody, and Blake and Scott and I are going to have a quick conversation, if we may. I don't know whether are you going to be free for a moment, Blake?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So I guess I don't mind having Jim and James partake of this either, and because it's not like a secret that I have, but I'm concerned about whether or not the discussion that we're having is truly engaging, and whether it is truly informative, whether people are getting a better sense of how Spinoza is working, how he's doing his philosophy.
Right. One thing I can say is I don't think that anyone can get Spinoza just by being a member of this group. They're going to have to actually do the work and study it and read it, and maybe as they're reading it, come up with questions. And so let's say if we don't have another meeting for a week, during that week they're reading a lot of these propositions and trying to make sense out of it. And there's going to be, a whole bunch of questions that are in their head about, well, this doesn't make any sense. This is obviously not true, that kind of thing. And they write those down, and then they bring them up in the meeting, and then we all discuss them and maybe get, inch forward a little bit. So maybe stressing that point in the description on the meetup group or something.
Yeah.
Because no one's going to get it from what we're talking about, but what we're talking about can be very helpful, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to get it by yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly how a meeting would be most helpful, is to do the work, recognize what's hard to accept, and then come to a meeting and say, I find it really hard to accept this idea or that idea, or how does this, is it really true that this follows from one proposition or another? Is it really true? Is it valid? And I think that's really where the value of the group is, but there's no way, you're absolutely right, there's no way to get around reading each of the propositions as a unit and understanding it and grappling with it. That I think is something that can't be avoided. And so I
Could
was
you
just
put could you put the propositions on the screen so we could
yeah,
read
we
them
can
one by one?
we can do that. You see, what we originally decided was that because it's so important that everyone read the text beforehand, that instead of, like, I just did a Leibniz reading group, right, of the monadology, and I would be putting the monadology up on the screen, each section, some of the commentary, and reading it. And I wasn't sure whether that was really as the most efficient and effective way of looking at the monadology, and to be reading through each of the propositions and then going on and reading the corollaries and the scholium that you find for each proposition in the Spinoza, that would be even more time consuming, and it would require even more patience on the part of the members of the group who are just passively listening. So a live reading of the ethics, I don't think that would be the best approach. But I can certainly, put the.
I think it would help people to focus so that we know
Yeah.
exactly what you're referring to.
I think I agree with you, Jim. I actually had my notes on a paper, and I could have put them on display, and I now regret not doing that.
Yeah.
I could have done that, and that would have been helpful. I agree.
What's
See,
helpful for me
this
is
is the way this is the way that I would do it. Go ahead. Sorry, Scott.
no, it was me. I was going to say that what's
Oh.
helpful for me is to try to understand Spinoza in the context of basic modern science, notions of understanding the world. What do you think about those? The idea of using examples from modern science to sort of support Spinoza's, idea of substance.
Yeah, I thought I was doing that.
Yeah, I think you were doing a little bit of that. Yeah, and so that's really helpful.
Yeah, I was trying to. That's why I keep stressing that he's appealing to people of his age and time, and we think a bit differently, and we have different conceptions of stuff. That's why I try to say, when he's talking about God, he's really talking about the universe or everything. That's why I kind of stress that, because once you see that, if you think about that in your mind, you start to read his text, you think, oh yeah, well, that's obviously true. That's obviously true. It flows pretty easily. But if you are stuck on the idea of God being this Judeo-Christian anthropomorphic being, and you're trying to prove it through Spinoza's thing, you're going to have a lot of trouble. You're going to keep saying, I don't understand, because you're fighting it. You're trying to, make it seem, you're trying to get Spinoza to prove your own ideas, which he's not going to do. So I was trying to make it plain and straightforward, which it kind of ultimately is.
See, the problem with using science to illustrate these things is, first of all, I know nothing about science. Okay, and I don't think that Spinoza himself relies on anything that you would regard as being strict science. Like, he uses Descartes' physics, for example, and Descartes' physics, I think, at the time, were very influential, and they're, it's a good body of ideas. But I'm not sure whether or not a modern physicist would say that they are basically true. I think that a modern physicist would say there's serious limitations to Descartes' conception of the physical nature. And so if you start talking about modern physics, then you would see that Spinoza was his ideas were somewhat at odds with modern physics. Because listen, James, my short answer is this. I'm not interested in knowing whether or not Spinoza accurately maps out the world as it is understood according to modern physics. I want to know whether this is a coherent and rational body of ideas that drive towards something like a true demonstration of how happiness can be achieved in the world. that sort of sounded corny, but that's really what I'm interested in. I want to know whether Spinoza's making a valid argument.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Well, in physics, they're trying to prove that there is a basic substance like string theory, right? That underlies that's the basic substance.
Yeah.
And so a lot of basic physics or biology or chemistry are also pointing in that area, in that the idea that there is one basic substance that underlies our world and us, trying to explain things according to this one basic substance. That's what I mean. I just very not really into complex scientific theories, but very basic stuff. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, what's interesting is that Einstein and Spinoza were strong determinists. And since then we've had this idea of the uncertainty principle. And so a lot of ideas in physics and modern physics are that everything is based on these random events. It's interesting to me how if everything is based on so many random events, how everything seems so causally and effective. There's not a lot of magic going on in the world. It all seems to be, it happened because of this and that happened because of that. So it's not a lot of like random things going on. I read, and I said this last time, that I read Hawking's book, Brief History of Time, I think it was called. And in there, he has a statement, which I actually quote in my book, that he says that it's possible that this whole uncertainty principle is wrong and that we just haven't seen what the underlying principle is yet. Because the truth is, like I said, every single time I drop a glass of water, it falls to the floor and breaks. It isn't like, 1 out of 100 times it flies another way. It seems to be real exact in the macro world. And if the macro world is 100% made up of the subatomic world, and the subatomic world is completely random, how do you reconcile those? And what's interesting, and I also talk about this in my paper, is that the world is made up from a common notion is made up of 3 things: cause and effect determinism things, free will, and again, this is a common notion, and random events. Now, if you cut out free will, which is what we did, and you're left even with random events, random events still doesn't give you free will. It just gives you random events. So the point is that personally, I'm uncertain that random events actually exist. I'm more inclined to think what Hawking said and what Einstein believed, which is that we're going to find out there's an underlying determinism going on in there. But for the moment, the prevailing opinion is this random events. And that's fine, because that doesn't really damage Spinoza at all, because that doesn't give you free will. All it does is give you a random element. That's all.
I think a lot of people who argue for free will make that mistake in thinking that somehow random events include free will. That's not it at all. That's not what we mean by free will.
That's right. That's the part they miss. Yeah. Yeah, because I have to admit, being a human being, it's I don't know if offensive is the word, but something like offensive to find out you're not free. That you're just an automaton. It's humiliating. It's not a nice thing to feel, but we're not dealing with what feels good. We're dealing with what the truth seems to be. And from
Yeah,
all
there's
the
an interesting discussion on free will on YouTube right now with a neurologist from Stanford. I can't remember his name, but he's basically said, from a neurologist perspective, it doesn't make any sense.
it's all biological,
All biological, yes.
yeah, all these processes are going on, and they're just fundamental physics, cause and effect kind of things. So, and Spinoza says, one of the things he says is that we think we're free because we're conscious of the past, but not conscious of the future. So it looks like it's free. Because we don't really understand all the causes that caused us to get there. Just like when you throw dice, you think it's falling randomly. It's not random at all. I mean, you may be can't get the numbers you want, but nevertheless, it's a causal effect going on there.
When you come to when you think of the principle of sufficient reason, I think that the principle of sufficient reason alone shows that necessity prevails in terms of a sequence of efficient causes and effects in the world, right? I think that shows it would be inconsistent to make a claim for the principle of sufficient reason and not at the same time accept that efficient causation unfolds in a sequence with absolute necessity. And I have no problem accepting the principle of sufficient reason to the extent that I find it impossible to understand the world in any other terms than the principle of sufficient reason. I think the principle of sufficient reason alone shows that necessity there is nothing other than necessity unfolding in the world, that everything unfolds of necessity. I think that's quite clear. I don't understand why anyone can deny the principle of sufficient reason. It just seems beyond me that they could do so. I think that quite often it's just a matter of misunderstanding it. Anyway, okay, so we now know. I think what I'm resolved to do for the next meeting is, I haven't decided yet, but I will decide very shortly which propositions I'm going to do, and I'm going to put them on the meetup page, and I'm going to say, on the meetup page, I'm going to say, everyone ought to read these propositions very closely and understand them, because that's what we'll be talking about at this next meeting.
Will the next meeting be on a Saturday?
Yeah, at 8. They're always
Same time slot.
Yeah. They're always at the same.
I've got to
time.
go. Thank you very much. I'm glad you brought up David Hume. I thought that was an interesting connection.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Now,
Yeah.
is I'm just I'm going to stop recording this.
Okay.
Do you want me to send this to you somehow, Blake?
I don't know how you could. It's too big.
I think it would be rather big.
It's more
I
than
wish I could figure out how to stop it. Oh, stop. No, that's not it. How do you stop this recording?
on the bottom, there's a little thing that has a square. I just hit my stop.
A square?
Yeah, there's a little square on that bottom panel where the record button used to be. I had one anyway, and I just hit stop, so maybe I have it.
Oh, I found it. Okay.